Hey everybody, Max Bulbin here alongside the Athletics Corey Pronman for another episode of the Athletic Hockey Show Prospect Series. We got some redrafts today, 2023, 2024, 2025. We're looking back. Corey just had a series of stories out on the Athletic breaking down those classes, and there's some big movement here, Corey. We can just kind of get right into it in this process here, and let's start with the most recent one. There's probably the least major movement here, but we'll start right at the top with Matvei Schaefer. The big difference here in Matvei Schaefer is not that he's the number one prospect, it's that you have him in really kind of rare air, that NHL star tier.
Yeah, and I think going into the draft, the conversation was between him and Michael Misa, who went second overall to the Sharks. And I think in the media, and even with teams, they thought like, okay, like this is reasonably close. I think almost every evaluator I talked to in the NHL still had Schaefer at one or the clear one, but they didn't think it was like a gigantic gap between the two players. There were plenty of people I talked to in the league who thought Misa could be a number one center in the NHL. So that by itself would lend to a very high projection for a player. And I still think people think that he could be number one center, although not on the Sharks, obviously. But in the years since that's passed, I think Misa, he struggled at the start, didn't have a great World Juniors, had a very good second half, though, for the Sharks. I still think I'm high on this. You're high on this player. He's looks like a premium young center prospect. But as everyone knows, the Calder Trophy winning Schaefer had just an absolutely monster year. And the level of offense he showed right out of the gate as a very young 18-year-old, I think he's like an August or a September birth date. And for what he did last season, and with the great skating and the size and the competitiveness and the tremendous character this guy has overall, like he looks like one of the premier young players in the league. I think after Celebrini, if you said who would you want to build a team around for the next 10 and 15 years, I think a lot of people are going to name him, quite frankly. And yeah, the gap right now is not even close.
It's funny, like San Jose had the second pick in this draft. Can you imagine if the Sharks had gotten Matvei Schaefer and they were building around Celebrini and Schaefer, who, for as much as the word generational gets misused, those are the two guys of the last decade who would best fit the label at their positions.
Right, it'd be Crosby Malkin, but in a slightly different variation.
Yeah, unbelievable. Where would you rank Schaefer among active D? I mean, it's a little bit of an offshoot from what this exercise was, but the NHL just kind of came out with their NHL Network just came out with their rankings, and Schaefer's already, I think he was 7 on that list, and I wanted to be like, that seems early for that, but what do you think?
Well, we were just going through this exercise for Team Canada. We're making a Team Canada. He's on our team, right?
Yep.
Right. So, right there, that's top 6 Canadian D. The USA has quite a few good defensemen. So, is he a top 4D on Team USA? Like, are you putting him over Rowinski, over Quinn Hughes? Like, probably not over, even over Slavin. Like,
we end up leaving Slavin off that team, I think, in the end.
I know, but it's just you and I now talking kind of thing. So, I would guess no. So that's still top 10. Then you got to put like Dowling in there. You got to put Heiskanen in there. So I would say like 7 to 13 sounds right to me. Where would you have him?
I think right around 10. I just think it's early to elevate over some like I think he was above Sanderson on that list, and that one to me, it's like I think that's a very similar style of player. Schaefer may end up having a little more offense than Sanderson, but Sanderson's offense is already pretty elite. When you go back and look at what Jake Sanderson did last year, if he didn't miss those 15 games or whatever it was, I think he's potentially top 3 for the Norris, but at least top 5. He had every bit the underlying numbers that Seider and Heiskanen did, and better offensive production last year. I think he's a guy that gets slept on. I'm trying to think of who else he was above.
I think Ottawa, if they would just gotten a couple of saves last year, there's a lot of things on that team that could have been perceived differently.
Yeah, no, absolutely. All right, continue to move through that 2025 class. The big riser at the very top of the draft, and again, when we're talking the top of the draft, big movement can be just a few spots. It's Porter Martone getting in between Misa and Anton Frundell in that second tier. He comes in at number 3 on this redraft. Martone just wowed at the end of the year.
Yeah, and both had a great year at Michigan State and obviously in the NHL. It really is the NHL stuff that kind of moved the needle. How he looked in the regular season, how he looked in the playoffs. The big thing with Martone was always how is the skating going to look at the next level, and it's very early, and you got to keep watching and keep seeing how he adjusts year over year. But early on, he showed that I think the pace was not too fast for him. I'm not saying his skating's an asset in the NHL, but when you consider how smart he is and how hard he works and his size, I think he's got the traits to be a legit top line wing.
So that top couple groupings, Schaefer in tier 1, Misa, Martone, Frundell in tier 2, there's no surprises there. But when we get into the next tier here, which is bubble top and middle of the lineup player, ranks 5 to 11, all of a sudden there's some names that I don't know that people are going to necessarily have been expecting here. Again, at the top of that tier, Denoye O'Brien, no surprises. McQueen, not really a surprise. Even Keishon Aitchison, he goes a little higher than he did in the real draft. But you start getting into Jack Nesbitt at number 9, and we still haven't said the names James Hagens, Brady Martin, Ben Kindel, who played a lot in the NHL last year. What does a guy like Nesbitt do to jump some of those names?
I think people will be surprised by Nesbitt because his production in the OHL was just around a little over a point per game last year. But what you're looking at the projection of a player who is, a skilled big man. It's not high-end skill, but you saw at the World Junior Summer Showcase, he's got some skill, and he's very physical. And when you look at what that can project to in 4 or 5 years, there's a lot of qualities in his game that you can see transitioning into being a valuable NHL center. Even if his skating isn't great, even if the creativity in his game isn't fantastic, does Martin land louder hits, and does guys like a Hagens or a Cole Reschny make flashier plays? For sure. But I think, those guys are 5'10", 5'11". This guy's about 6'5". I think when he gets to playing versus men, I like how his game could translate to the higher levels. I think of someone like a Morgan Geekie, for example, and I could see a lot of similarities between their games.
It's interesting because he went 12 in the actual draft, so 9 on this redraft is really not that different a neighborhood, but there was such a reaction to him going 12 in the original draft that to see him actually higher on this list, I think is the notable thing.
Yeah, and I think we talked about this back then. That was not his perception in the league. The league loved the player. Yeah. If Philly didn't take him, he was going 1 or 2 picks later, and there was a bunch of interest in that player at the time. And I think even despite the fact he didn't have a great year, I don't think the interest has faded just because he was still a top player on a top OHL team last year. He was a big part of why Windsor won a lot of games. So I think the projection is still fairly strong for this player, even if his offense isn't spectacular.
He went 1 pick after Ben Kindel in the actual draft that year. And Kindel, for my money, probably the best relative to draft spot kind of season anyone had out of this group. How could you do better than being a second or third line center in the NHL for a lot of the last season? He comes in a little bit lower here than I was expecting.
It's a very similar conversation to what we discussed with Zach Benson on the show a week ago, in that I think Kindel had a great year. I think he's going to have a long career. I think he's going to produce a lot of points. I do wonder if the offense is special out of him, which I still have some minor reservations about. I think he's going to have pretty good offense. He's competitive. I don't think I think he's a good skater. I don't think he's an elite skating 5'10" guy. I do wonder what the projection of that is ultimately, unless he is you've made the conversation of the other day we talked about these two-way centers. Can they get to a Sorelli type?
Yeah.
I do wonder, unless he's that kind of premier two-way player, I don't know if the offense is going to be special enough to be that kind of guy you win with in the playoffs. But I can see that he's going to have more points than some of the guys that I have ranked ahead of him.
And we will go back to some of those guys higher on the list. Kindle comes in at 19. 20 is Cole Reschny, another guy who I thought maybe would be a little higher, especially after we just watched him at the World Junior Summer Showcase. He was Canada's best center at that event.
And that's right where he went in the draft. So then I would ask you, what's the big difference between Kindle and Reschny? Other than the fact that I know Kindle did in the NHL, obviously that's a major point in his favor. But if you looked at the 5-6 year projection for these players, stylistically, what's the big difference between them?
You'd probably say Kindel maybe a little more natural of a matchup center, Reschny a little more offense, but I get your point that it probably nets out to being similar. You're probably talking about a second line player, a second line wing probably for Reschny, and Kindel it's a 2 or 3C.
Yeah, that's kind of what I think. I think they're third line centers, second line wings, depending on where they end up.
Yeah. All right, let's move back up the list then. Number 10 is Josh Ravensbergen. And the goalie going high in the draft is always a subject of much debate. Ravensbergen didn't go that high. He went 30, but still a first-round goalie, which is kind of continuing to get rarer. And to see one jump up a list like this is always notable.
Well, he was a guy I had rated in this range coming into his draft year after he had a spectacular draft minus 1 year. And then he struggled in his draft season. But there was still he's big, he's really athletic, he's twitchy. Like you just wish he was a little bit more consistent. And then this past season, he was great. He was one of the best goalies in the CHL. The CHL obviously is a little bit, especially the Western League, was a little bit watered down relative to past years. But I still think you look at the athleticism, you look at the ability to make high difficulty saves, you look at a lot more consistency in terms of his reads and his tracking. And then, I think he just ticks all the boxes of what you potentially want in a starting NHL goaltender.
Alexander Zharovsky, I mean, Montreal's, we talked about it with, obviously, with their 2022 class and finding Lane Hutson. They find another second-round find in Alexander Zharovsky. He comes in at number 11 here after being a second-round pick.
Yep, a guy whose skill level just jumps out right at you when you watch him. He was very good in the KHL as an 18-year-old. He was very productive. At a very high level, makes a lot of plays. He's not just a skilled guy though. He can attack. He's direct. Good skater. A lot there to like as a potential top 6 winger at the next level. You're going to want to see if he can back it up this season. But presuming he does, I think the value for this player will continue to go up as maybe even a potential trade chip for the Montreal Canadiens.
Yeah. All right. I want to talk about some guys who really elevated themselves. But before we do it, there's a cluster of players, 12 to 14. This is in the middle of the lineup tier. James Hagens, Brady Martin, Radim, Mrtka, all top 10 picks. They're not that far outside the top 10 here. We're talking about ranks 12 to 14 in this cluster. But when you have a top 10 pick and your guy moves the opposite direction, it's a notable thing for fans out there. And I think particularly with Hagens. Martin, I think everyone understands that the year did not pop. The offense did not pop. But Hagens
did. Mrtka.
And same with Mrtka. Hagens did have a good college season. There's always been the questions, and I think maybe you were kind of trending this direction on him even before the draft. But let's just talk about kind of where James Hagens stands.
Hagens is a tough evaluation because, to your point, Max, he was had a highly productive year at Boston College. There's a couple of things there I kind of balance with Hagens. One, I thought despite the fact he had a good World Juniors, he wasn't great there. I thought when he turned pro, he was just okay at the higher levels. So, and I do still have some concerns on how he gets to the inside and how his game is going to translate up levels, despite the fact he's a great skater and he has a ton of skill. So it's kind of a balancing act with him. I could see still a top 6 wing. I'm not sure what have you thought when you've watched Hagens? Do you see a top 6 center? Because that's been a struggle for me.
No, I agree with you. What I've seen is I see a player who I think has maybe more inside elements to his game than I was giving him credit for. And I don't know if that was a misavow the first time around, but just he's around the net a pretty good amount. It's just less electric quality. And I think for a center of that size, you got to have that. And we've always talked about him in relative terms to Logan Cooley and Jack Hughes. I don't know if it's the NTDP, the body type, whatever. But it doesn't have that kind of single solo creation feel to me that those other two do. And so I think maybe you're talking about seeing him as someone who kicks out to the wing and can be a really good offensive piece on the wing, but probably isn't going to drive your team as a second line center.
Right. It's probably more Keller than it is Hughes or Cooley. And even then, I don't know if
there's more zip. Keller's got more zip, I think, too. Yeah.
That's what, yeah. So that's kind of my struggle with him. Obviously, if he he's turning pro. If he kills it next year as a pro, then you have to revisit your assumptions there on how his game translates. But I do have some concerns there in terms of how he's going to fare against men. And I know Bruins fans won't like that, but I still think he's a really good player. It's just I have some minor reservations that despite his highly productive college season, didn't quite answer those questions.
So here's like a relevant one, right? Like, would you take him or Frank Nazar?
Probably Nazar.
And so I think that kind of speaks to the point, right? Is like Nazar's, it's a similar kind of flavor, but I think Nazar is a little faster. I think the skill level is probably similar, but Nazar's jam is even a level higher than that. So I'm more confident that Nazar would be a center. And so that kind of tells you. I'm just trying to think of like the centers that fit this mold, and they don't end up looking that much like Hagens in the end.
There aren't many small centers in the NHL period. So and the ones who are either super competitive or they're extremely dynamic.
And he kind of fits in the middle of that. So I think he probably ends up like a good 60-point wing, and I think that's still a worthwhile player where the Boston Bruins drafted him. But it makes sense to me. One spot behind him is an opposite story here. Or not one spot behind him, sorry, a few spots behind him. Hagens at 12. At number 15 is Benjamin Rautiainen. He's at number 15 after being 108 in the draft to the Lightning. Tampa kind of built their dynasty by finding guys who outperformed to this level. What's Rautiainen doing to trend that way?
Yeah, obviously Rautiainen is not a guy we discussed a ton, in part because let's face it, most of the questions we get are from big market teams, and he's a Tampa prospect. He was also a draft +2 when he was drafted. So he was a 20-year-old when he had this big year in Liga, which quality has kind of dwindled a little bit in recent times, but still had 77 points in 59 games in Liga, leading that league in scoring. Extremely impressive campaign, high skill level, high hockey sense. Makes a ton of plays, good pace to his game. I think whenever you have like a 5'11", 6'0" guy who's a good, not great skater, they can look like a dime a dozen type. But this guy looks like a little different. I think he's got a pretty good chance, I think, to be a middle six scoring wing in the NHL, guy who can help a power play. And it's why I think Tampa's system's in all right shape. I like him. I like Connor Geekie. I really like Sam O'Reilly, who we're going to get to in the next segment. I'm not saying they have a ton of guys, but they got enough to either help transition them into the NHL over the next few years or use them as trade chips to potentially go out and get some help to try and make one or two last runs with this aging core.
All right, well, let's take a break right there. And you said it, we'll come back. We're going to do 2024. All right, we are back. We are moving now into the 2024 redraft, Corey. No surprises at the top. Macklin Celebrini's in a tier of his own, elite NHL player. Beckett Seneca and Ivan Demidov, two guys who jostled in that Calder race this year, both had outstanding rookie seasons together in a tier at numbers 2 and 3, Seneca 2, Demidov 3. And then it starts to get interesting. When I think about the 2024 draft class, yes, it's defined by Celebrini. But the hype in it was all about this group of defensemen and what order they were going to go in. And we're talking about Zeev Buium. We're talking about Anton Salayev. We're talking about Artyom Levshunov, who actually went number 2. Zane Parekh, who went 9. Sam Dickinson, who went 11. It was a really splashy group of defensemen. And yet, the defenseman who is listed first on your redraft in a tier of his own at number 4 is Cole Hutson.
I'll get into my rationale for why that is, but I'm kind of curious for your opinion, Max, because Buium, Levshunov, Dickinson, Parekh, all played in the NHL this past year. Hutson played whatever it was, 10, 12 games.
14, yeah.
From what you saw, who did you, not how you'd rank him, but just from what you saw, who do you think was the most impressive defenseman from this group in the NHL last season?
Well, Hutson, in the games he played, was the most effective, most productive, right? I still think Dickinson's tools are something to really watch. Now, you do question what the ultimate ceiling is there just because of the kind of vision, creativity element to that. But I do think when you 6'3" and skate like that, it has a lot of advantages. And I think, I'm not giving up on Artyom Levshunov either. I think there's huge upside in his game. But I get where you're going with this because I think Cole Hutson, in his 14-game sample, small as it may have been, seemed like he had the least trouble transitioning to the league, which is usually a really good sign.
Yeah, it's not just 14 games. He had 2 fantastic years in college, too. And it's easy to compare him, obviously, to his brother and how he did at BU and his early transition into the NHL. And, maybe not Dickinson, but you compare him to, say, Parekh, you compare him to Levshunov, you compare him to Buium. Guys were supposed to be these offensively tilted players. And I thought when I watched those and now at those end of the season games could always be deceiving a little bit. But Washington was pushing. This wasn't like this was like a bad team or whatever.
Yep.
So, I looked at how Hutson played and I saw a difference maker right away. Not a guy who was shy, not a guy who was struggling. Like, I thought he looked impactful right from the get-go.
I think that's most interesting, like in contrast to Buium, because Buium was the guy that I was most sure was going to just because with the way he transitioned into college hockey and how good he was as a freshman in college hockey, I kind of just expected, obviously not to the degree, like college hockey is a different thing from the NHL, but I kind of expected Buium to just come in and be just as fearless, just as effective immediately. I'm not saying he was afraid when he got into the league, but it wasn't the same Zeev Buium like assertiveness that I expected to see right in the NHL. And he's got
Definitely
the
not as
midseason
dynamic.
trade, right? He's got the midseason trade that I think disrupts things too. And I don't know that it's we may see a very different Zeev Buium when he starts from zero in Vancouver. But that's the one that I think I expected to be, and I think he's your number 2 on this group. He's at number 5, one spot behind Hutson, albeit in a different tier. He's the one I'm most watching to kind of get back on track.
And I think their games are quite comparable. Both are not elite skaters, but they're good skaters. They're both extremely intelligent and creative. They both defend okay despite the size. So I think there's some similarities between the two players, Hutson and Buium, but Hutson I just think showed better against men, despite in a much more limited sample.
So you rank Levshunov down at 18, and when you go from 2 to 18, that's a huge swing. What are you and aren't you seeing with Levshunov? What are the big fears, and where is there still room for confidence here?
Well, that's why I compared him to Perrick and compared him to Buium, and it's like because this is a guy who, despite the fact he is 6'2", 6'2.5", he's supposed to be a guy who's supposed to be known for his offense. He definitely hasn't shown that he's been known for his defense as a pro. So you look at him, you say, okay, well then he must have a lot of offense, and I think that offense and his playmaking has been inconsistent as a pro. And really, between his American League games and his NHL games, he has not really been, a dynamo. He's been good offensively. I don't know if I consider him, like I said, a dynamic offensive player to go with so-so defensive play. And it's like, okay, well then you're just kind of banking on the tools here, which is, still a really good toolkit, but I think you'd want a little bit more certainty there, especially since he's like a good skater. He's not like a Sam Dickinson level skater.
What I'm holding on to with Levshunov, and at the time of this draft, Noah Dobson was coming off the best season of his career. He was a top 10 Norris finisher. He was a point per game defender. And I think that was my comp for him. I don't remember if that was your comp for him at the time.
So,
It would have been within the range, I think.
Yeah, I think so, yeah.
So Noah Dobson didn't get to the NHL until he was in his age 20 season. He only played 34 games that year. The next, the Islanders really managed him carefully. It wasn't until he was 22 that he really popped and had a big year. And I'm hoping that if that comparison had merit to it, that it's really just that Artyom Levshunov's getting thrown into the fire earlier, and it's going to, kind of be able to work these things out. Different philosophy to developing him. Like, I think the Islanders were kind of pulling him in one game, out the other. Not that dissimilar to how the Ducks did with Leo Carlsson. That's kind of what I'm holding on to.
I think it's perfectly reasonable, but then the question becomes, like, would you take, if you had to make a trade today, would you take him over, Boy, would you take him over Hutson? Would you take him over Dickinson? Like, those are questions that I think I would struggle with, just given the data we have so far. Obviously, if he has like 50, 60 points next year, and he's 6'2" and he can skate, then obviously he leaps back into being a premium young player. Especially given how much Chicago has struggled. Like, he's had every opportunity there to try and help and elevate that team. It's not like the Islanders back then with Dobson, where they were they're a little bit more competitive. So I have some reservations, but it's
I still really think he's going to be a 50-plus point D. Where I've moved on him, if at all, is I thought he was going to be a 50-point D who you trusted in defensive situations, and I'm less sure about that element today than I was.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think he gets to like good offense. The question is, given his D isn't great, can he get to that 60, 70 point level, which I'm less certain on right now.
This is an interesting, and we've done some of this as we've done these redrafts, talked about some bigger picture lessons, but Luke Hughes is a guy who had obvious offense in college. And when I watched him, I would always go, okay, he's really special, but man, there's some defensive moments that scare the crap out of me. And I was more hesitant on Luke than you for that reason. And with Levshunov, I kind of just decided, you know what, I just think this is going to work out. But I think there are some rhymes in those two games there where there's a little bit of, there's great offensive skill set, and Luke's is obviously even more dynamic than Levshunov's. But there's a real push and pull to that offensive and defensive game. And I've always generally kind of assumed like the offense is going to win out as they get, and it may still with Luke. He's still a pretty young player. But I wonder if there's a lesson to be learned there about you do want to see a little more baseline defensive game, even at a young age.
I would argue that Luke's skating was a tier higher too. Like that's like I think like his skating is elite, whereas I think Levshunov's is just like pretty good.
Yeah, that's totally fair. All right, so one of the other interesting elements of this class is how many guys from later in it have already moved into the very high echelons here. Ilya Protas is number 6 on your redraft list. He went 75 initially. Igor Chernyshov went in the second round. He's at number 7. Sam O'Reilly was the last pick of the first round. He's at number 8. Julius Mietinen went in the second round. He's at number 9. You don't have to talk about them as a cluster, but is there anything in that group that really stands out as notable? Chernyshov's year in the NHL last year was excellent for a young player.
Yeah, I don't think Chernyshov surprised people who loved him because I think he just fell because of like some weird stuff that happened at the end of the year there where he couldn't participate in the Milstein camp because he got sunburnt and like he just it rubbed people the wrong way. And also he didn't end his year great over in Russia. Like there was a combination of factors, but he was still really productive over in Russia over his couple of year career there playing between the MHL and the KHL, big, fast, competitive. Like there were some indicators there. Sam O'Reilly, still a first round pick. Obviously the offense has developed more than people expected. MVP of the OHL regular season playoffs to go with the big, the way he plays heavy, the competitive two-way style, like there's a lot there to like too. Ilya Protas is the one that I think really stunned some people and how quickly he developed. Like you could go back and look at his season. He was, I think, like well under a point per game in the USHL in his draft year. Now, and I think like the first half of the year, he was getting like healthy scratched in some at points for his USHL team, Des Moines, I think. And then second half of the year, I think he was closer to a point per game. And he was getting a little bit more productive. But the transition he made from USHL to being like a dominant OHL player, almost from the get-go for Windsor. And then right from the OHL as a 19-year-old to being a dominant American League player. And he goes from the American League and he's, does reasonably well in the NHL. Like for a guy who's not a great skater, like to show that kind of ability to play up levels that quickly shows, great hockey sense, a really strong drive in this player's game. And I mean, it's hard to doubt this player at this point. Like, because all he does every year is just get dramatically better year after year.
So the tier is bubble, top, and middle of the lineup player. And if you're at the top of that tier, I got to assume you're toward the top of that bubble. Does that mean you think Ilya Protas can be a like legit second line center on a good team?
Yes.
All right. I mean, that's a huge find for Washington. And they've pulled off this rebuild on the fly about as well as I can imagine a team doing it. It's been extremely impressive.
I mean, just him and Hutson in the same draft, I think, just significantly changes their future outlook, especially at those positions, D and center, because they had drafted a ton of wings with first-round picks up until they drafted Oliver Savanto this summer. And to find a center prospect and a D prospect, that looks like they could be, premium young players, both in the second round. I think Protas was Protas in the third round?
Ilya Protas was the 75th pick, so yeah, mid third round.
Yeah, so at that point in the draft, like I said, that changes things significantly for their future outlook.
Another third rounder from that year who ends up really high on this list at number 11 is Thomas Lavoie from the Utah Mammoth. And this is not a name that I'm super versed on. I imagine our audience is not super versed on, but number 11 on your list, that's a really high placement here.
Yeah, well, he was a former number 1 overall pick in his Q draft. There were some questions on his offense going into his season, and you don't want to ever overreact too much to a 19-year-old pointing in the queue. Like, that's not like a huge development at times, but he had a really strong year in the queue, really good playoffs there for Chicoutimi. One of the better defensemen in the queue overall this past season. I thought he should have been on the World Junior team. Kind of surprised he wasn't. 6'4", he could skate, makes a reliable first pass, good point shot, very physical player. This is a guy, look at a similar player like Maverick Lamru, who Utah drafted. That I don't think there's that much of a difference between the two players, and I think Lamru is going to play in the NHL. I think this guy's going to play in the NHL. There's a lot to like there, I think, and obviously there's going to be a big what if. Like we'll see how much offense comes with him to the American League next season. That's the one real question in this guy's game. But I thought when I watched Chicoutimi towards the end of the year there, like he just like kept jumping out at me. Like he was like I thought like borderline dominant. I thought in some of those games for in the Q playoffs. So like I just got really sold by this player.
And like I said, D, one of the big storylines of this class, right above him is Adam Jiricek, who was kind of at the fringe of that top group that we had talked about that year. He ends up going number 16, but there were moments, especially he got hurt at the World Juniors, I remember. It looked like he had a chance to elevate himself into that group of 6 defensemen that we talked so much about. He ends up as the 3rd defenseman on this list behind Cole Hutson and Zeev Buium.
Yeah, I mean, after Hutson, you could argue he was the 2nd best defenseman in the OHL last season. Big, fast, physical, has, good puck moving ability, good point shot, good hockey sense. I think he has every indication he could be a top 4 defenseman for the Blues one day.
All right, that's the 2024 class. We're going to take another break. We'll come back with 2023. All right, we are back. We'll close it out today with the 2023 class, Corey. And really, the headline here is pretty chalky. Connor Bedard, tier of his own at number 1. Leo Carlsson, the debate was Carlsson or Fantilli at 2. It was Carlsson on draft day. It's Carlsson here. He is in a tier of his own. That feels notable. Fantilli, though, in a tier of his own at 3. Will Smith went 4. He's still 4. And then, you start to get a little bit of variation, but it's still 7 of the top 8 picks on the actual draft are your top 7 today.
Which is a little unusual in that usually as time goes by, this is the draft the furthest out from when the draft actually happened. This is 3 years now. Usually you see some variation, but I think that speaks to particularly that those top 5 forwards, which were Bedard, Fantilli, Carlsson, Smith, Michkov, that they were so high up there that even if they fell off a little bit, the drop could only be so much. And they were such premium players that it would be hard, I think, to unseat them unless somebody just had an absolutely monster rise or they had just a disastrous fall.
It does feel notable that Michkov stays exactly at 7 because when that pick gets made, it's under the assumption that he's got this contract in Russia. He's not going to be able to come over for a while. That actually changes. He comes over much faster than anyone anticipated and has an outstanding rookie year. And so naturally you're thinking, all right, this guy's going to be, is he going to be 3, 4? But then he has the rocky year last season and he ends up seemingly exactly where he's supposed to be. 7 on draft day, 7 on this list.
What did you think of that? Like where I had him, would you get him over Smith? Would you get him over Leonard? Like that's kind of the conversation.
I don't think I'd be ready to get him over Smith. I think the conversation starts with Leonard at 5, but I do get that there's elements to Ryan Leonard's game. I think Michkov's going to score more than Leonard throughout their careers. I think you agree with
absolutely.
That. But there's elements to Leonard's game where I don't think a coach is ever going to hesitate to throw Ryan Leonard on the ice in an important situation, especially a year or 2 from now once he's really established in this league. That may still be true of Michkov. So I think I could argue him up to 5, and I understand why you highlight Smith. I think there's kind of a similar skill perimeter flavor there, but I do think Smith's technical ability to play the center and just
better athlete.
Yeah, like the skating. So that's where I would lean to Smith. But to me, the conversation starts at 5, but I don't really have that much of a problem with it at 7. The one I think people will really pick a nit with is Simashev being over him.
Well, there's a reason Simashev went so high on draft day, is that he's this huge defenseman. He's like 6'5", 6'5.5". He can really skate. He's very competitive. And you look at the offense he showed in the American League this year, he was like a near a point per game player in the American League as a 20-year-old. Like this is another Simon Edvinsson. Like this to me is like he's a premium young defenseman. He's a guy who I think is going to play major two-way minutes in the NHL.
And that is super valuable. It's just I think it's hard for people sometimes, and including for me, to put guys who it's still projection over guys who have this much kind of body of work now in the NHL. 2 seasons of body of work in the NHL.
Yeah, I think that comes down to the position a little bit too. Like if he centers and D, I always tend to have a a preference for, and I just think Simashev's got a really good chance to be like a number 2D in the NHL.
Yeah.
And I just think if he hits that, like, I'd rather take that over. Well, the issue with Michkov is there was a point where I was thinking special wing, like first line 80, 90 point wing. I'm thinking now more like 60, 70. And
which is still first line.
It is, but if that's the case, I'd rather take the number 2D.
Yeah, totally fair. Another Russian winger comes in right behind Michkov, and I think this is one of the stories of the class, is that you think that Matvei Michkov is going to be the Russian winger who really outshines, and he looks like it's pretty much par. Roman Kantserov goes in the second round to the Blackhawks. He's just one pick after Michkov on your redraft at number 8.
And he was a dominant player in the KHL this past year, one of the best players on one of the best teams. Doesn't play the game like Michkov. Michkov is about skill and hockey sense. This guy is about his compete. He's direct. He's, on the same team that drafted Frank Nazar. He plays a lot like Nazar, albeit more as a winger. Like, he's very, very competitive, very good around the net. But you look at the offense he's shown versus men already. I kind of feel pretty confident he's going to score the NHL. Is he going to be an elite scorer? I don't know. Is he middle six? Is he top six? Time will tell. But I think he's got a really good chance to help Chicago win games.
At number 9 is a player that 2 years ago, I don't think either of us would have imagined is in the top 10 on this list. And that's Charlie Stramel. When he got to Michigan State after his first couple years at Wisconsin, at that point, I think you're kind of just hoping this guy's still going to make it, still going to play in the NHL. But for him to now be in this tier, top or bubble of the top and middle of the lineup, right behind names like Michkov and Kantserov, Charlie Stramel has really gotten himself back on track.
He looks like the guy he was coming into his draft year. Like, he was one of the best players on one of the best teams in college hockey last year. Really for 2 years running at Michigan State. He was a top 6 center for them, playing a lot of important minutes. He's big, he's fast, he's really physical. And, the offense wasn't fantastic, but he scored at a reasonable level at college. And I think the way he plays gives you a lot of really strong feelings that he's going to be able to take some of that offense to the pro level, that he could be a middle 6 center who can, PK, second power play, physical, playoff style centerman. Wins really good at faceoffs. Like, there's a lot of things in his game that are very attractive. And given that the level he played at in college hockey, I feel pretty confident he's going to be a good pro.
Another NTDP guy that I think overlapped with Stramel in this class is Danny Nelson, and he was a second-round pick in this class at 49 for the Islanders. He's at number 17 now. I mainly bring him up not because I think 17 is like a surprising place for Danny Nelson. He's had a pretty good post-draft trajectory, but because his brother is in this current class, Sammy, and could be one of the more interesting names in it. I mostly wanted to draw, like, where do you think that the overlap and where are the differences between Sammy and Danny?
They're both big. They both skate well. They're both physical. I just think Sammy has more offense. I think with Danny, you're always going to wonder, like, I think he's going to play, but I think you always wonder, is he going to be more than like a third line center? When it's all said and done, third line wing, third line center. His hockey sense has always been kind of average. I think with Sammy, he's got good hockey sense. He's got good, and great shot, great offense. Not like fantastic offense, but I think there is more natural scoring in his game than there is to Danny's.
Yeah. All right. Earlier in the show, I mentioned how chalky it is, and that's going to probably limit the length of this segment here. Like I said, 7 of the top 8 still the top 7. Obviously, that means one has dropped a little bit, and that's David Reinbacher. He hasn't dropped a ton, but from 5 to 14 in that range of the draft, every pick does kind of count. I don't think David Reinbacher's been bad. It's just that he hasn't maybe had some of the sex appeal to what he's done since the draft.
Yeah, I think that's fair. Part of that has been injuries. He's been hurt a lot over the last few years. He was mostly healthy this past year. He was fairly productive. He played a big role on a top American League team in Laval. I think when you watch Reinbacher, you do wonder, like, what does he ultimately project as? Is he a tough minutes guy? Is he a PK guy? Is he a power play guy? That's kind of always been what he is. He's like this does it all type of player, which I still think is valuable. But I also have watched him, and I have wondered, like, when I saw him in his draft year, I saw really good offense. I saw a really physical, hard to play against guy. He didn't just check every box; he checked a lot of them with emphasis. I haven't seen that emphasis as much lately. Like I'm kind of wondering what he ultimately is going to be. But I think that some of the parts could still lead to him being like, a number 4 defenseman in the NHL.
Which I think if he can be that, that's really all Montreal needs him to be at this point. When you find a Hutson, you have Guhle. Obviously, ideally, if he found a way to blossom into a 2-3, that's perfect world. But as long as he's in the top 4, that's really all Montreal needs.
Yeah, ideally a little bit more than that, especially since they took him before Simashev. But I get what you're saying.
Well, if you have Hutson as your top pair guy and kind of your driver, ideally, yeah, you have a guy who matches up and is also a true top pair guy next to him. But a lot of the number ones in this league end up playing with guys who you might call a second pair D, and it just kind of works out, especially if the role fit is as obvious as Reinbacher would be to Hutson.
Right. I think the question with Montreal is, like, other than Guhle, who are their quote-unquote playoff-style defenders? And that's where I think you got to hope Reinbacher kind of embraces that jam a little bit more in his game.
Yeah. All right, that's the 2023 class. So that is going to do it for us today on this redraft episode of the Athletic Hockey Show Prospect Series. Remember, you can read all of these on theathletic.com, and actually I would really recommend you do so. Plenty of players that we did not get into today that I'm sure you're wanting to hear about. They are in the redrafts, most likely. A couple of them dropped out of the first rounds entirely. But you can read that on theathletic.com. We'll talk to you soon. Thanks for watching. Make sure to like and subscribe and ring the bell to stay informed and catch new episodes every Monday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday. And in the meantime, you can join our Discord community. We'll see you there.